Okay, thank you very much for joining the Trusted Sec webinar on blockchain security, aligning to the upcoming digital business initiatives. This has been very interesting for me, especially on where things are currently, where they're headed. We are starting to hear from clients trickling in on their digital business initiatives. So it seems like we're slowly but surely moving past the hype and into aligning security into some of the things that the business is looking to do. My name is Stephen Marshwitz, the Director of Project Development here at Trusted Sec. And just want to let you know that this will be recorded and will be on our website as well if you miss any parts of it or would like to listen back again. So a little bit about Trusted Sec. First, we've been in business for about 7 years now. We have a full service security consulting security organization. We can help assess it. We can help build it. We can help test it. And then if you have any issues with incident response, we're able to help with that as well. We really created with the goal to help the security industry and change the security industry for a better. We really pride ourselves on doing the right things right and move that across our entire organization and the type of folks that we bring aboard. Trusted Sec is different than most other organizations in that, has one person typically that knows what they're doing and a bunch of people underneath. We flip that model and really have a tremendous amount of senior consultants, really the tops in their game that are really coming across and able to do a great job for you. So with that, let me introduce Justin Lieblein. Justin is our practice lead of PCI here, but he's done really so much more in his career. In addition to that, he's been an advisor to various frameworks and standards. He's given a few previous webinars. If you haven't checked them out, one on what's new in PCI and the other a couple in cloud security, program building, but then cloud security and containers. So it was really fascinating. A ton of awesome information in there. If sort of piggybacking on some of this and the new initiatives and where things are going with containers and et cetera, to really help build some of the knowledge that you have. So with that, let me turn it over to Justin to take over the webinar for us. Justin?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think you just said that I'm a jack of all trades, master of nothing and everything, but we'll go with that, right?
No.
So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining here. I'm really excited to actually, talk about this subject. I've done a few different presentations locally and around the Pittsburgh area. In and around blockchain and specifically in around the security. Obviously it's a newer technology. It's been around for about 10 years now, but a lot of people still have that kind of mystery cloud over it. And obviously we're going to talk a little bit about the hype later and some of the watch outs, in those specifics. But today we wanted to talk about some of the great use cases with it and then some of the security ramifications of being aware that as if you're familiar with it already, there are a ton of, this is transparent, secure, always up and everything. Everybody touts, those attributes. But we're going to dive into it. And, some of that is just a little bit of hype. So we'll get started here. So first off, I want to give a little bit of background because a lot of people aren't familiar with blockchain and the technology behind it. So it first started back in 2008. There was a white paper actually released out that basically there was a number of different technology components that blockchain kind of merges into one, really in around the cryptographic, methods and things of that nature. But blockchain was kind of the first to kind of combine them and put it into a use case into this perspective. So 2008, a person, Satoshi Nakamoto, which wrote this paper, put it out there, said, here's how I'm envisioning a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And this was basically the first use case that was proposed with this, but blockchain has a number of other things we'll talk about a little bit later there. Who is Satoshi Nakamoto? Nobody really knows. There's been a number of people that actually claim to be him, but I believe that's more hype and everything. In fact, there was somebody just a few months ago that has claimed to be him that basically said that I remember reading the white paper on this originally, and then he had to correct himself and said, "Oh yeah, that's the one I wrote," type of thing. Some people said he was just poking fun at it, but nobody in true form that somebody believes has actually stood up to actually be this person and everything. So that was October 2008. In January 2009 was actually the first block of Bitcoin that was actually released, known as the Genesis block. And that's really what started all of this movement here with it. So the best explanation that I like to kind of put an analogy to is when people ask, what is blockchain? The best part about that is thinking about it from a digital ledger, type of thing. So if you remember back in the day, people would keep ledgers and, all the businesses keep a general ledger. But basically it's a way to record bits and pieces of information and then confirm with, duplicate or triplicate signatures that this is accurate. And this is the way they had to, do things. It's like to measure up in each transaction and then have accountability to build to say this transaction is valid, and these 2-3 people can actually confirm it's the case with it. So the way it traditionally works today in at least the financial sector is there's one centralized ledger for each of the financial institutions. So they have a payment system that goes over a network, but at the end of the day, when the reconciliation happens for those payments, it's basically between two institutions saying, I owe you 20, here's 20, and and that I got $20. And then they reconcile each of those ledgers on their system, but they keep independent ledgers with this. The way a distributed ledger works is that everybody has a copy of the ledger, and sending it out over a peer-to-peer network and coordinating on the ledger and making sure that everybody's on the same book, throughout that. And it's all over the world here. I just actually pulled this week, actually October 15th, as the date says. And there's a number of people that keep a copy of this. This is specifically the Bitcoin ledger. So as you can see, there's almost 2,400 nodes just in the United States alone, communicating this and coordinating with everybody else in the world with the same information on what transactions are going over. So what makes blockchain technology different? Because all we talked about is a ledger, which is nothing new, type of thing. It really comes down to a consensus form. So how do I, coordinating with independent organizations or entities, actually come to a conclusion that these are the right transactions in this volume and we all agree upon that? So one of the things that it actually solves, if some people might if familiar with some of the terms, it's the Byzantine general problem. So the general's problem is basically this. You have, a number of generals stationed around, something that they're trying to attack. But how do you coordinate an attack without knowing that, the people that are around that all coordinate at the same time, at the same place, and do the same action with this, Obviously, just doing a communication path is there, but the communication could be intercepted. There could be traders into that. And it's essentially getting to a consensus that everybody agrees to what the actual solution is by working through that through a group of people, with that there. So we're going to talk about just two today. Obviously, we're not going to dive too deep into this from a technology perspective. Keep in mind that when we're talking about blockchain, there's a lot of variations out there. And really, it's in around mainly the consensus, but there's other variations that we'll talk about with like Ethereum and the actual contracts and everything. But today we're going to talk about proof of work and proof of stake and how those kind of effectively work within the algorithm there. So proof of work is the most common out there. This is what Bitcoin is based on. This is what Ethereum is based on. And there's a number of other ones that do basically a proof of work type of thing. So essentially what proof of work is think of it almost like brute forcing something. So the block of all the transactions are basically hashed together through a Merkle tree type of thing, where basically it's a tree of hashes just hatching each other together until you get down to one hash. And it takes that hash and it says, you know, based on this hash here, I have to get 4 zeros, which is known as the difficulty at the beginning of this calculated hash, by introducing nons into it. Number only used once, you know. So once the group of transactions come out, we have this Merkle root hash. Then all the quote unquote miners out there, this is where you get the term, you know, mining Bitcoin. They get to work on trying to solve this, and their reward on solving this is actually Bitcoin. So right now you get 12.5 Bitcoins by solving this proof of work. And it's confirmable. So, you know, in this case, I just did a high level one. This obviously isn't a hash, but the hello world, and then you put kind of the a number at the end of it. And with Bitcoin, it can go up to, I think it's 4.2 million as a number you can actually put on the end of it. But everybody's basically brute forcing this to find out from a difficult level what the number of zeros with it. And the difficulty level is actually adjusted based on the timing it takes to actually solve a lot of these proofs with it. So you go through this, somebody comes up with it, and then they announce it over the network, the blockchain network, that I've solved it. Here's my nonce. Here's the hash, and you know, and this is what the calculation is. And then every one of the other nodes come out and say, "Yep, I confirmed it," and now, you know, we can tie this transaction to the last block. And I've actually pulled one that was just recently done, I believe, within the last couple of, actually today with this. And you can actually see this is actually one of the chains, one of the blocks today, the number of transactions in it. You can actually see the difficulty level about midway through on the middle of the left-hand side. Type of thing. And then you see the block reward, which is down at the bottom, the nonce that was calculated. And then you see on the right-hand side, some of the things that we were just talking about. So the previous block hash, the hash that was just calculated, and the Merkle root that was just generated with that. So basically all this does is puts an integrity level in and around all these different transactions, and one block on the chain is tied to another block, and it keeps going down the chain, tying the previous block to the new block that was just calculated with all the transactions within the last 10 minutes, specifically to Bitcoin here. I know I'm throwing a lot of information out, but this is pretty important just to get some of the basics into this here. One of the things to actually really understand is, obviously, if you have a bunch of computers doing essentially brute forcing all the time, 24/7 to do this, there's a lot of power consumption. So looking at this at, you know, bitcoinenergyconsumption.com, they actually calculate, you know, how much terawatts per hour is being generated to solve just some of these proofs on the Bitcoin blockchain. Just to put it in context, you know, this is essentially the carbon footprint of Denmark. The electrical energy is from Austria, and some of the waste is, you know, from Luxembourg. So basically a small country just to run the blockchain network is what's going used for the energy with this. So proof of stake is a little bit different. This is basically the, it's for mining. It depends on how much ownership you have in the specific the blockchain cryptocurrency and everything. So a good example, if you own 1% of Dash, Dash was one of the first cryptocurrencies to actually come out with a proof of stake. You basically have a 1% chance on each one of the blocks being mined to actually be the miner of that block there. It does offer some potential benefits. Obviously, it's not as much CPU, GPU processing intensive, and it's a little bit more expensive to monopolize the currency. We'll talk about some of the flaws in the mining, but essentially you need not only the equipment to mine at a significant rate, but you also need a stake out of that coin. The theory behind proof of stake is that the more invested you are into the currency, the less you have a desire to actually cause harm to that. So if you own, say, 50%, you don't want to devalue it because you would lose that 50%. And that's kind of the theory behind proof of stake. One of the things that's important to talk about here with chain technology is there are such a thing as orphans. The certain situations when we're talking about proof of work is there could be and does happen a number of times that two nodes will come up with the same proof solution at the same time, type of thing, and they'll communicate it out through the network. And this causes what's called orphans. So one will solve it and another one will solve it. But there are corrections into the chain technology that actually compensate for this. First off, the longest chain with this is always the parent chain. So if there's another calculation that happens after that, and there's the previous block hasn't got that yet, all of a sudden all the nodes are instructed to actually look at the longest chain with that. So it'll be a self-correction to hop back over to the alternate chain there. Also too, there's some other stuff that depending on we talked about the difficulty, so how many zeros are in front, they'll also settle on if somebody has a higher difficulty. Obviously it has to be above the minimum difficulty, but if it's higher, they'll often go with that block instead of the other orphaned one with that there. So a little bit of the hype here, obviously with new technology and anything that's on the hype curve, it comes with it people that want to take advantage of it. So, and we're all familiar with this in the security industry, anything that puts, a name to it, like machine learning, artificial intelligence, they're putting it into it. And sometimes it's not even an applicable solution. They'll throw in blockchain into a closed application that does nothing for nothing to do with this. So a lot of people just look to get on, like I said, the bandwagon. And oftentimes too, we've even talked with some of the companies and they'll propose like, hey, I want to do this in this type of scenario. But sometimes we have to have an honest conversation and say, are you looking for a solution, to fit the problem with that. So, just making sure that there is a proper use case. And of course, this is something from Reuters. They actually did a little bit of analysis on a couple of companies that people are just throwing blockchain in their name. And for a few of the companies, they actually tripled their value, their stock value since the name change and everything. It doesn't last too long. And I think there's less of that now. This is an article, I believe, last year type of thing. But just keep in mind that, just because there's something in the name doesn't mean, it has any type of solution worthwhile with it. And also too, there's a lot of companies looking to take advantage of this. So this was pretty funny. Last year, there was a company called BitConnect that they put together essentially, another cryptocurrency, but they promised, a return, a risk-free return on this. And a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon. In fact, they were valued at their highest point at $2.6 billion with this, with investors and also people jumping in to actually put some of their money in. It ended up 1.5 million got scammed. It really only took 11 days to actually drop from a significant $432 to $25 with this. And it's really funny, like part of their marketing scheme, it was pretty apparent to some of us that follow this that it's definitely a pyramid scheme because they had a pyramid, in their explanation of how they did this and everything. So And this is one of their press releases, what they came with. And obviously there was a lot of bad press release from some of the more notable people in the industry that actually know what they're talking about. But they also got a couple of states coming after them with cease and desist letters for some of this stuff. And that's was pretty much some of the death knell. And they're basically broke out of business, and they have a number of lawsuits I think are still pending, to go after some of the owners. And even they hired a whole bunch of people that I think they gave kickbacks to, but there's a number of people out on YouTube that, were just spouting like this is the greatest thing ever. But then when they got down to it, there's Crypto Nick was a big proponent of BitConnect, but he didn't even know what a public-private key pair was and how it worked, type of thing. So just be careful out there. Sometimes it seems great, and what your neighbor or your coworker tells is great. Don't trust it. Do your own research and investigate for yourself. So, but there is good with it. There are a number of companies that over the past number of years have been exploring a number of things with this. So Microsoft, JP Morgan Chase, a number of banks have done exploratory projects into some type of blockchain technology. A lot of them are looking at Ethereum, where you can implement smart contracts, which are essentially programs that you run on the network to execute different functionalities with it. One of the early adopters was Republic of Georgia. They actually turned their entire title system over to a blockchain-based application, because they were getting a lot of fraud, and a lot of local offices would be basically handing over titles to some of their best friends and just doing that. So they wanted accountability and transparency to be wide open and public with this. So they did that. The Ford one, I just actually saw that this week. Honestly, I'm not sure how good this is actually from a technology standpoint. They're basically espousing that their cars are going to be basically reporting their energy efficiency onto a recorded blockchain. And they wanted to be transparent and thought this would be the best way to do that. But quite honestly, I'm not sure that's it'll be interesting to see, but I don't think that will be a technology that in this use case worth it. And then Walmart announced last year that it was looking to improve food safety by tracking, from the growers to the distributors to the, end result into the stores, to track a lot of this stuff on an open chain. One of their hopes that I was reading about was that if there is something, that they do have to do a recall, they can actually pinpoint it back to the source very quickly and everything. So let's get into some of the security. We did a whole bunch of background on, the good, the bad, and some of the foundational stuff. Let's talk some of the mining attacks with this. So the first one that we want to talk about is the 51% attack. So as you saw, and what we talked about is that you need a consensus with this. And specifically with Bitcoin, if a majority of people, let's say, it would have to be, nation state or something like that, decide to turn, transactions and want to dictate what transactions go in and out, they would basically need to own 51% of the network. And while Bitcoin might be a bad example, there are a lot of smaller up and coming coins that this is very feasible, and there have been valid attacks against this. So when you only have a few hundred nodes into, a network, injecting a few hundred nodes more, if you have the capital to do that, can quickly take over and potentially, wreak havoc onto that chain there. This is just something from a Bitcoin thing, the bigger you get, the more impractical it gets. So the cost of a 51% attack, as it is today, is $15 billion, $15.5 billion on hardware costs alone. And then the attack would be, even more than that. It's 10 million per day to get into that. So while it's not potentially impossible, the question goes to, it's probably impractical with this. And from an interest point, it's too expensive for, anybody to reasonably do that from that perspective there. The Eclipse attack, aka 34% attack. This is one of the things where, we showed the network of nodes and everybody has a number of peers that they're connected to within the distributed network. There are some cases where they can isolate certain nodes, be a denial of service attack or something like that, basically cutting off the communication to a smaller network. So they basically eclipse a bigger network from that, and they're able to actually manipulate that smaller network a lot better than the whole network in and of itself. So this is just another way that they look at about basically interrupting the network and the mining activities to influence to their own own interests there. And then one of the things, it's less common nowadays, but there were some cases where selfish cartel mining, basically this is where somebody would actually solve the proof of work. And then instead of reporting it out onto the network, that they would actually keep it to themselves and then start mining the next block without telling everybody else to stop, and everything. This basically gives them almost kind of a head start, but as the probability of a proof of work gets less and less, even if you have a lot of resources, this doesn't get feasible in those cases there. The other thing that we talked about a little bit is Ethereum and smart contract security. The unique thing to this is that you introduce the ability to run code. And so it does have tokens as well onto the blockchain, but it also has what's called smart contracts. And this is programmable logic that you work into this, and actually you can basically program them to anything you kind of want. I've seen some applications where they'll actually do vesting options into a company. So say I sign up to, be a partner in a company and I get 10%, but it gets vested in, 3 years. Well, you could actually put that logic right into the contract and it won't execute the actual trade until 3 years. The advantage of that in that use case there is that it's not relying on the company to actually do the transfer. It will automatically happen in 3 years if they're, if you're still with the company and everything. So there are a lot of very cool use cases, but keep in mind, and we'll actually explore some of these, it's code. And as we know from the security industry, if there's a human involved in writing the code, it can be bad, type of thing. And one of the things that I just want to bring up too, you must contribute, Ether, they call it gas, to execute the code. This actually works to prevent somebody using the Ethereum, chain to actually execute a denial of service. If they actually wanted to do that, it would, be in the millions of dollars if they wanted to execute that. So they theoretically could, but then you take the incentive from, it costing you money to actually execute all this on all the different nodes and everything. So one of the cool projects that's out there is DASP. It's a decentralized application security project. So mainly looking at a lot of the blockchain technologies and specifically a lot on Ethereum. And they actually have, a top list of all this stuff, and they keep news articles on it. It's really cool and good reference. Some of the examples I have here are straight from there. So definitely go check it out for more information and everything. But we're going to explore, 3 of them here, the top 3. So reentry is, or reoccurrence, sometimes it's called. So the interesting thing about this is this was actually a very real case that actually happened with the DAO. And if you're familiar a little bit with some of the currency out there, Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, this actually caused the fork. They decided to roll back. It was about $50 million that somebody was executing this flaw with the DAO. and they made a controversial decision to do a hard fork. A hard fork is basically, if you compare it to like a firmware upgrade, that all the nodes basically has to get the same code to update how the core protocol works and everything. And it takes a lot of coordination. If you don't do it right, then you get a disjointed chain and orphans all over the place from the node perspective. So, and it was controversial because, you know, one of the key clouts of blockchain is that once it's on the chain, it can't be removed from the chain. It's not necessarily true. They can do a hard fork and reset where the chain like split off, and then you have basically two main root chains and everything. And in this case, they split off and had the Ethereum Classic and Ethereum with this resetting a lot of the balance of that $50 million there. So it was kind of controversial to say, you know, we can't do this every time there's a hack. You know, we need to just learn from the mistakes and go forward. So, but you can read more about this, specifically with this withdrawal here. On the third line there, the message sender call value. This is basically a standard withdrawal if you're executing, you know, how much from an amount and making sure that the sender it has more than the amount that's actually requested to withdraw, and then sending it to the contract that's requesting this to basically transfer that amount. The interesting thing about this is that call value, and just walking through this, and on line 3, the victim contract calls the call value amount on a low-level function that sends it to the malicious contract. This is somebody that programmed some code into another smart contract. The one thing is that it has a capability in Solidity, and that there's a fallback function that gets called when there's a withdrawal. Well, if you put it in the victim's contract to the withdrawal again, if you notice this code, it doesn't actually withdraw the balance until after that call is made. So what happens is you get a recursive calling, and you keep emptying their wallet for the initial amount over and over and over again without it actually withdrawing the amount. So this is what happened with the DAO with this reentry recursion flaw in this case here. Another one is, you know, permissions with this. So this is a common code where you assign the owner to the sender of the funds. The problem is this is normally executed within the constructor of the function. And on top of that, this isn't even a private function. They've actually labeled it a public function. So in this case, you can actually take ownership of the contract and then do whatever the permissions are within that contract itself. And you could actually transfer money. You could execute whatever the code, you know, had into there, you know, and this function should actually be in the constructor of it. And the last one we have for this here is just on actually I have 3 examples, and this is just logic problems with this. So the first one here, you know, we look at, you know, requiring the balance of the message sender minus the amount is greater than 0. So you can't go over the end of the amount. The problem with this is if you notice the uint into the withdraw function there, that's an unsigned integer. Unsigned integers don't have positive or negative. They're just a number with this. So if I put in an amount greater than the balance of the message sender, it will actually loop to a bigger number with it. So it'll basically go 0 and then whatever the top UN amount would be. So if it was, you know, 60,000, it would go to that top there. And all of a sudden you might be approved for that amount, but then you have a new amount that it's checking for, and you can wipe out, you know, the transaction with that. The pop array of things function, this is a logic problem with it. And looking at that, if you look at the require, the length is greater than or equal to 0. But then it subtracts the length off of that array there. The problem is greater than or equal to 0. The equal to should not be there because if it's already 0, there's nothing to actually pop off of that. So it's actually has a one-off kind of problem there with the code. Finally, a votes one, and very similar to the first function there, it's using unsigned integers for this. So no matter upvotes versus downvotes, it will never be less than 0 for this to actually delete a post, into this. Again, this is just logic problems that people, put the wrong, either data types or logic, into the functionality that definitely have to be audited and reviewed, if you're ever thinking about pushing something out along these lines. So just some final comments as we wrap up here. Be skeptical. Obviously this is, not that new of a technology, but it's definitely still very much misunderstood in a lot of these aspects here. So just because it's hyped up and, people claim it's the end all be all, validate for yourself. And with that, do your own research. I always recommend that even in investing into cryptocurrency and everything, go download their white paper. Pretty much all the coins, they'll come out with like what their protocol is about, what solutions they're or problems they're trying to achieve, how they're actually architected, what their consensus algorithm is, whether they're using a variation of proof of work, proof of stake, things of that nature. Even some coins like Ripple is proof of correctness, which is their own kind of variation on that. Just do your own research, find out whether it's worth its salt or not, type of thing. And then the last thing is, just because it says secure, obviously doesn't mean it. This is probably preaching the choir here on the Trusted Sec webinar. But, just because you're on an Ethereum contract and they say, this is secure, it's human logic into code, and looking at that code, you need to validate, against what the contract's actually doing, the logic with it, doing the assumptions that are built into the contract, testing it from a security perspective, and seeing those, there's variations with that. So do your research and get somebody knowledgeable to help you out with this. So if you're thinking about deploying something along this lines, get somebody that knows, specifically about blockchain, but also the security ramifications to it, because there's a lot of gotchas into it. And with that, I'm all done. So I think I saw a couple of questions here. Steve, come in.
Yep. Yeah. So, but again, feel free to continue to put questions in the Q&A box and we will get them answered. So a couple to start. Is there any legal or compliance framework for blockchain?
So legal or compliance, there's nothing obviously mandated, but there are some that are setting up like good security frameworks for it. There's one on GitHub that is the Ethereum smart contract security. If you Google that within GitHub, I think you'll be able to find it. And there's some other ones, but they're all voluntary with it. But yeah, that's a good resource with that. There's a lot of good resources. If you Google, either blockchain security, a lot of people have published stuff out on the wire. Also, too, I ran a lab that was on Ethernaut, which is actually kind of a capture the flag type thing for Ethereum and some of the security holes. We actually posted up a lot of the solutions out on GitHub. So if you look up Jam Leapline, I think it's lab-contract security is the actual the GitHub repo. But those are great ones as well to, experiment with some of the capture the flag stuff that's out there.
Does blockchain have to go through the same application security process, or is it different, and how is it different?
Yeah, so it all depends. So obviously, if we're dealing with code, I would definitely recommend getting research. If you're deploying it in-house, like something with a smart contract with Ethereum, you should definitely get somebody come in from a consultant basis or somebody in-house if this is going to be a serious deployment there. Other stuff you might just, hire, a consultant with it. And like we talked about with like a lot of the Bitcoin stuff and everything, or if you're deploying your own code, it's good to run through those logic problems at the start, but then it's kind of built into the coin or the framework itself. So if you don't change it much, obviously, and and it's validated from the start, you might be good from not hiring somebody in. But if you're going to make changes, it's definitely prudent to get somebody in. The bottom line is, if you roll your own, it's almost like rolling your own crypto. It's just never a good idea. Get some experts in to help you do it right, because the last thing you want to do is roll it out and some incident happens that you either lose a lot of money or reputational status there.
Great, thank you. One came in. Besides cryptocurrencies, what are the practical uses for blockchain, and what are some of the things that you're seeing?
Yep. So we talked about a few of them and some of the companies. A lot of them are using it to, basically take out a lot of the middleman and build that consensus without maintaining a individual ledger, in those aspects. And we talked about the Walmart scenario and, and what Ford's doing with the car efficiencies. A lot of people are exploring it. Because of it's a new technology and it is kind of cool basically to build a consensus without a trust necessarily. But a lot of people are experimenting with it. So there's certain companies out there experimenting with turning blockchain technology into basically a file share, and you're storing files out on the chain. I don't think that's a practical use. I don't think that will go anywhere, but people are playing with it, type of thing. I do think the Walmart application is a good use for it. Tracking a supply chain, into that, and having a number of companies that are basically tied to that chain be able to contribute, and then and it's fully transparent. So anytime anybody needs to do that, to look at, a root cause, if there's, an outbreak of, there's bad tomatoes or somewhere, okay, where did that all go? And it'd be easily diagnosed to expedite, recall or just troubleshooting, some of the stuff and everything. So.
Excellent. Thank you. For identities, how can you address the need for privacy if it's an open ledger or just other technologies? How would you address identity and the need for privacy?
Yep. Yeah. So there's actually, it's interesting. There's a lot of different, they're kind of coined as like privacy coins and everything. With Bitcoin, there are some identifying marks on, especially when you interconnect with like some of the exchanges and everything. There are other coins out there that are trying to be more private, so you could actually perform a transaction without the fear of being discovered with this. And obviously there's a lot of criminal activity and drugs and stuff of that nature, but I mean there are some practical privacy stuff. So Monero is a coin that really focuses on it, even though there has been some papers that basically through analysis you could eventually get down to potentially who the end node is that actually that got sent out initially, but the common base and with it is public-private key pair. That's the first one with that, and then other coins focus on kind of hiding the trail with that. So Monero's, I am actually a fan of Monero, so definitely check that out.
Okay, great. And maybe similarly, what do you see having the greatest impact on the majority of businesses, or maybe core businesses that aren't the cutting edge or Walmart's? What types of things would you see that where the greatest impact is going to be just in the next couple of years?
Yeah, so I think I know a number of people that are working on it's basically a variation of blockchain, or the Bitcoin. They're called like Lightning networks, and they're actually, when Bitcoin first came out, while it was a peer-to-peer transaction, it's slow, type of thing. So a block only gets mined every 10 minutes. So you're waiting while probably faster than the banks, that's 3 to 5 days to clear potentially. It's still longer than what it should be optimized for. So a lot of people have been working on basically Lightning networks that basically optimizes the actual transaction without compromising some of the consensus variables. And also too, there's doing like some side channel stuff to, again, trying to roll up a lot of transactions into a side blockchain channel. We talked about the orphans. Some people are trying to use orphans and then merge it back into the main chain with it. So those are definitely good applications. And I think still the core application that will be great. And it's actually one of the reasons that I dove into some of the blockchain technology, years ago and everything, was the financial transactions, to be able to, kind of cut off the middleman and do, a good peer-to-peer over a collaborative network and fully transparent and everything like that. I still think that's the number one way. Obviously, it's been slowed down quite a bit with regulations and people investigating, and it's kind of a mixed bag. The SEC just came out with some of their stances. The IRS sent out a letter a month or two ago, basically saying like that they are taxable capital gains, income. So make sure you report it. So everybody's still, trying to catch up with the new technology, and politicians want to get, their fingers into it. But I still think that's the most practical and the most likely to actually cement into a great working application.
Okay, great. What should you say when asked, where are you with blockchain security? So assuming this might be a CISO or a director of security, any quick 3 things to say, or, how would you, if you really haven't done all your homework, how would, what are some maybe 3 things that you would respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, from a blockchain security perspective, it depends on what you're using it for. If you're not using it in-house, you don't really have to worry about it. There's a lot of companies that, on the more practical sense, if you're not building your own chain or, collaborating over, a closed chain, which is a chain amongst like, a number of banks or businesses that you basically have to be authorized on the chain. If you're not doing anything like that, there's no concern from a security perspective because you're not using it. There are companies that consider taking, cryptocurrency from a payment perspective. The only real concern with that is getting your money out, because it fluctuates way more than, an actual hard currency like the dollar. So if you accept $10 in Bitcoin to, for a payment, tomorrow it might be $9.50, type of thing. Or it could be $11.50, but there is a risk of, the time you actually accept that from payment and then from exchanging it, and then some of the fees associated to that. But generally speaking, if you're working on that, like I mentioned before, get somebody to help you out with it. It pays multiple dividends to look at that from somebody that knows what they're talking about.
Gotcha. I have them come in. How do you envision that blockchain security could change with quantum computing?
Yeah.
That's a big one.
Yeah. So, and that's a really interesting one. A lot of them with the hashing algorithms that we saw. So Bitcoin is on, SHA-256. Ethereum uses SHA-3, I believe, type of thing. And if you're talking about, quantum computing, and once it kind of comes into a practical application, which I know a number of companies have working models with it, but it's not really available, to the large masses. I mean, encryption in general, because this is such based on encryption, would have to change. And I don't know if that would require like a hard fork, as we mentioned before, for them actually upgrading it, or going to an algorithm that's quantum resistant type of thing. That's really yet to be seen. And quite honestly, I haven't done a ton of research into that, just because we're years away, type of thing, with that being a reality. But it is in the back of the mind concern, from a number of people. And there might be, you'd have to look at it. The worst case is that they have to do a hard fork to switch to some of the algorithms, or just make a new chain and, and stop using, one of them, like they did with the Ethereum and Ethereum Classic.
Awesome. what could be or would be the DR plan for blockchain folks in your supply chain? So if you have blockchain throughout your supply chain or looking to implement it for third parties, how would DR work with that?
Yeah, so if you're talking about actually connecting to the chain itself, and if you're, for some reason can't connect into that, I mean, one of the things that's nice about any type of blockchain technology is by its nature, it's distributed. So if you can't connect to one node, there's probably 40 other nodes that you're be able to connect to on the network. So it's naturally resistant from that perspective. Now, if it's in your own building, obviously that's another matter altogether, and you just need connection out on the internet to basically get that done and everything. But that's the beauty about one of the things with blockchain is that everybody has the same copy of the ledger, and you can reach out to anybody to start basically syncing and get on the network. And in fact, you're connected to multiple nodes at a time, typically, when you're connected to most of the chains out there. So, yeah.
Gotcha. Great. Could this be a game changer for Google or Facebook? So how would that work, or what could blockchain really do to those types of that level of company?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I mean, Facebook announced months ago that they were coming out with their own chain type of thing, and they were going to use it for payment called Libra. And it was all the hype, and they had a number of big companies first backing it, including Visa and I believe Chase and everything. Since then, especially with all the hype with Facebook and that they weren't too great with privacy and some of the the black eyes that they got with that, there's been a number of regulatory and congressional interest into that. And in fact, I think there's somebody from Facebook, maybe even Zuckerberg, might be going to Congress to actually talk about it next month, this month, something like that. But anyways, it's kind of stalled out. And in fact, there was while they announced a number of different companies that were first interested in it and actually be off the ground, I think you had to invest like $10 or $15 million to be on the ground floor of this. Companies are starting to kind of back off because they see some of the regulatory pressure with it. And it's not new. There are other companies that are experimenting. Facebook was the biggest to do that. And they'll be able to make money off it. And especially, you integrate with, a platform like Facebook type of thing. There'll be some just adoption based on that. Whether it'll actually take off and what the actual technology is behind it is left to be seen. So it's a question, of practicality when it comes down to the consumers, type of thing, and the value coming out of it. Because if it's just another money thing, why does consumer care it's on the blockchain, when they could just run their credit card? So there has to be real value, from a speed perspective or ease of use or something along that line to get mass adoption.
Okay, great. That pretty much wraps up the questions that we have, unless anyone else has any last ones they want to send across. But that was great, Justin. Really appreciate your time and a lot of valuable information there. Really appreciate it. And for those folks, yeah, thanks again. So, and for those folks on the line, again, we'll have this out there on the website for you, and look for our next webinars coming up in the future months. Thanks very much, and thanks again, Justin.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.